Thank you very much, Ruth, for this great introduction, and thank you all very much for including me in this conversation today. It is always a pleasure to be part of conversations that will set us up for success in this second phase of deep decarbonization. On the societal dilemma across the globe, let me start by saying that there is no such thing as a universal societal dilemma between growth and emissions. Like climate, the energy transition discourses of the past 20 years have been dominated by North American and European framing, terminology, and issues. In addition, both climate change and the energy transition have so far been discussed as natural science and technology issues. And this leaves a big part of the constituency outside the conversation. Researchers in both Trondheim and Bergen have helped us understand that only recently have we begun to understand and discuss these issues as political and ethical and social and cultural issues. In my view, this means that to succeed with the second phase of deep decarbonization, developing a simpler language and more inclusive governance is critical. Thankfully, we don't start from scratch. We have learned a lot in this first phase of decarbonization. Most of the EU have made significant progress decoupling the GDP growth from emissions, and so is the US, though from a very different emissions profile and economic context. We have more or less understood that economic incentives and voluntary action alone will not get us anywhere. Mandatory action is also needed. A price on greenhouse gas emissions and mandatory performance standards are both needed, but what is now important is that we keep it simple and effective. The Fridays for Future movement has radically changed the political landscape and articulated a societal need for action, not empty words or complicated policies that take a long time to agree on. Where I think we need to make more progress is in understanding that what worked in Europe or the US will not necessarily work in China or in India. Regions will have to find their own ways that work in their particular contexts. So one big understanding is that while the problems are global, solutions may often be regional or even local. On the question of how costs and benefits are allocated among customers and industry, basic ethics make it clear that if you know what to do and can act, you have a moral obligation to act. And this applies to both industry and consumers. However, discussing the energy transition in cost and benefit terms alone is problematic on two grounds. The first is that we don't actually know the cost or benefit of most aspects relating to the energy transition. We have never been here before. There is no data to analyze. And the second point is that industry and consumers use totally different metrics to measure costs and benefits. Emissions, quality of life, public health, they all are externalities that rarely ever feature in a price formula. There's this idea that ultimately it is consumers, through their buying power, deciding what activities companies and governments do more of and what activities they do less of. But this is based on the false assumption that the price of the products provides full visibility of costs and benefits, and it does not. We cannot measure absolutely everything. Moving on to the next conversation about the geographical perspectives on the just transition, I am worried by how narrowly the term just is understood in both Europe and the US, as in both cases it supports a very insular, domestic view, and not necessarily an inter-regional justice view. It basically boils down to focusing on managing the worst impacts for their domestic populations, leaving the world's most vulnerable in a perilous position. When discussing enabling global energy transitions, we basically mean technology transfers instead of financial transfers. And this is a significant barrier in helping the most vulnerable countries develop their own solutions and build their own capacity in a way that best supports their needs. Moving on to the last point for conversation, are targets for renewable energy and environmental goals aligned, and how do they match with the wishes of individuals and quality of life? As mentioned previously, renewable energy and environmental goals are often expressed in technical terms. For example, installed capacity, particulate matter, chemical characteristics, costs, and benefits. These goals have for a very long time been owned and articulated by a very narrow select group of people and contexts. So industry, executives, and to some extent NGOs, as well as some civil servants. As I mentioned earlier in my reflections, I think that we need a simpler language and a more inclusive type of governance that goes beyond those narrow groups and that moves from an essentially top-down process into a process where bottom-up and top-down communicate more and where feedback loops are continuous. The European Green Deal is essentially an agenda of delivery. And what this means is that the regional governments, cities, and rural areas and the citizens have to be part of the conversations from the start. And so do NGOs, as it is those constituencies who will have to take up all the new solutions developed by industry and think tanks. They have to take a seat at the table when the EU's energy infrastructure is discussed. We have to move beyond the paradigm of a few civil servants and industry executives sitting together to articulate what the world will look like in 2030 and 2050. This will inevitably lead us to a place where we discuss a broader set of metrics that go beyond CO2 emissions, technical standards, and price alone. Once the conversation expands, the framing to discuss human metrics and quality of life, progress will accelerate. Do renewables targets and environmental goals support our quality of life? It is very easy to say yes, but if we reflect on the human metrics, we have to go deeper and think, do they make us feel glad, engaged, calm, and relaxed? Or do they make us feel worried, sad, irritable, anxious, and lonely? Do they support us in building positive social relationships and social capital, a sense of belonging? These questions may sound abstract, rhetorical, and self-explanatory, but in my view, these are the critical questions that hamper, for example, Norway's transition out of oil and gas. The industry has scored quite high on most human quality of life metrics. Only when renewables and environmental goals are perceived to outcompete oil and gas in human well-being performance will we be able to make progress fast. These were some of the reflections I want to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Poppy, for that. It's very interesting to listen to you. And I have a couple of questions for you before we engage in the panel discussion. I think it was a very interesting last point you made there. So is it so that I could sort of conclude by saying that until we see real benefits for society in renewables, oil and gas will continue to win people's acceptance? Is that how you see it? Oh, I think you're muted, Poppy. You're not the first. Try again. No, it's still no sound. That's strange. Nope, I can't hear you. Wow. I have to say, we've been doing this all day and we haven't encountered much technical problems, which is great when we're sort of inviting the entire world to join us. I'm just curious to see what you can sum up here. If we can't manage this time, I'll just make sure to save some of the questions for you for the panel discussion, if that's okay with you. Yeah, okay, so we're going to do that. So we'll see you later, Poppy. So in meanwhile, you're going to have a lot of time to sort the audio things. Or are you with us now again, maybe?
I am from my phone.
Yes.
Does it work now?
Yes, it does. Now I can hear you. Perfect. So, yeah, so go ahead. Is this, I mean, is the discourse from the renewable industry not succeeding in a way in getting people's acceptance? Is that the problem, or where are we at that?
So I would say that it's not really the discourse that is not winning over people. I think the narrative and the discourse resonates with a lot of people. But my sentiment is that in countries that really have the potential to produce oil and gas and benefit from it, in many ways, the proof is in the pudding. So in regions like the ones I live in, of course, everybody has been working with the green transition for the past 10 years, with almost an unrelenting focus. But when it comes to, for example, finding jobs or finding a salary that can actually compare favorably to an oil and gas industry salary, the reality on the ground is a little bit different. And if you look, for example, at polls in Norway, as you know, Ruth, in September, there's going to be the national election. In my region, for example, 65% or 67% of the overall population wants to continue exploring and producing oil and gas. Um, and they're not necessarily, climate haters or climate deniers. No, not at all. It's also the region that has one of the highest uses of electric vehicles, highest use of cycling and biking infrastructure.
Yeah.
But the reality on the ground is that people have to. All these kind of controversies exist in each and every one of us, and I think until we actually and until the renewables industry delivers more and better jobs, it will be a very hard proposition, a very hard transition to deliver on the ground.
Because we don't want to lose our welfare and
Mm.
the level of welfare that we're having. You also were talking about the need for a simpler language, and you were also talking about the need for everyone to participate in the discussion. As you said, it can't just be a couple of people around a table discussing the EU energy policies, for instance. Are you calling for, in a way, an energy democracy where everyone is included? But how are you going to do that? I mean, I just can't imagine what that big table has to look like in order to get there. Or are we talking about smaller local groups working together, and then how do you see that being done?
Um, so, speaking for Europe, I think we already have the infrastructure in place, especially with the virus. We discovered that it's actually perfectly possible to engage and involve, as many people as any digital platform can fit into conversations on the future of energy. Uh, I think there's different levels on how this can be done, and it will be context specific depending on each country's kind of individual cultures. I would say that in some countries, we might still see some local groups organizing and influencing first at the national level and then engaging with their European peers. In other groups, there will be direct conversations across levels, as we've seen a lot more over the past year. And if we take an example on how Europe decides, how Europe governs decisions around its energy infrastructure, over the past 2 years, there's been a much higher challenge on the process, which is now more or less owned by the industry, by the energy infrastructure developers. NGOs want to be part of it. People want to be part of it, and increasingly this kind of rather big table that was, in the physical world, it would host anything between 50 and 100 people. It is now, there's a lot of pressure for this table to grow and host thousands of millions of people who are directly affected by, decisions around energy infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Poppy, that is all we have time for now. But you're going to join us again later on for the panel discussion. So thank you so far, and just stay put, and I'll call on you later on. Thank you for this far.